What if the greatest military victory of the war and a tactical miracle that erased 15,000 enemy soldiers in a flash was achieved only because one man decided to ignore every single command? Victory demands strict obedience, but sometimes survival demands treason. Today, we uncover the chilling details of the cannonball incident, how absolute insubordination led to absolute tactical success, and the terrible price paid for breaking the established rules of war. The echo was still ringing, not the roar of the guns, but the deafening silence that followed. The air tasted metallic, heavy with pulverized concrete and blood. Up on observation, post 4, Colonel Hayes didn't cheer. He couldn't move. He simply stared at the coordinates. Now an inferno where 5 regiments of the German 32nd Division had been marshaled moments before. It was a massacre, a surgical annihilation, 10 square kilometers of pure, unadulterated ruin. Hayes knew the numbers. He understood the tactical outcome. The war effort had been accelerated by months, perhaps years. But he also knew the chain of command had been severed, shattered by one man, 300 meters away, standing amidst his still smoking house. Captain Elias Thorne. He wasn't celebrating his miracle. He was checking his ammunition. He understood the gravity of his transgression. He had saved the entire front line. Yes, but he had fired the shot that saved the world and without permission. And for that, the rules dictated only one outcome: the firing squad. The echo was still ringing, but the focus shifted back. 3 critical hours before the metallic taste of victory, to the cold, unforgiving geography of Sector 7 Delta. It was October 18th, 1 o'clock hours, a date the history books would later gloss over as a minor defensive victory, failing to acknowledge it as the moment the entire western line nearly hemorrhaged into the mud. The stakes were absolute. A 4-kilometer break in the line at the Argonne Gap meant the immediate collapse of the Allied left flank, opening the door for the enemy's sweep toward the coast. Colonel Hayes knew this not from instinct, but from the relentless, punishing mathematics of command. The enemy had concentrated 5 elite regiments, a force multiplier designed specifically to exploit this weak point. The problem wasn't manpower or material. It was time. Hayes needed suppressive fire now. But the standard approval process for a division-level engagement mission required a minimum of 75 minutes, even with a clean line. The delays weren't mechanical, they were purely administrative, mandated by High Command, fearful of expending precious high-explosive ordnance on phantom targets. Inside the crumbling headquarters bunker, Captain Elias Thorne, head of the 38th Field Artillery Battery, watched the plotting map. He was a creature of grids and trajectory. Yet today, the grid felt like a cage. The rigid protocol for governed every movement. The request for Fire Form 3DB, the Ammunition Expenditure Justification Form 19C, and the necessary triplicate signatures verifying target elevation and wind drift. To load a shell, you needed a signature from an officer 3 levels above you. Thorne realized the absurdity. The communication wire cutting Hayes urging requests didn't run straight back to General Staff. It was deliberately routed through 3 secondary brigade HQs, each adding mandatory review time, a safeguard against panic that now served as a choke point for disaster. Hayes had tried to bypass the first checkpoint 45 minutes ago and was immediately rebuffed with a formal reprimand delivered via runner. Hayes slammed his fist onto the operational table, the dust motes dancing in the dim electric light. He was watching the inevitable disaster unfold in slow motion. The forward observer reports were becoming frantic, detailing the enemy assembler perfect textbook concentration of force. ready to punch through the weak trenches before sunrise. If the guns didn't fire within the next 30 minutes, the infantry would be overwhelmed, and the subsequent retreat would turn into a rout, costing thousands of lives and perhaps the entire campaign. Hayes, a man who lived and breathed regulation, understood the dark equation. By following the protocol, he was signing the death warrants of his own men. The rules were designed for efficiency and accountability during peacetime or planned attacks, but in this dynamic emergency, they were instruments of slaughter. Thorn, meanwhile, wasn't looking at the paperwork. He was studying the enemy's predictability. The German 32nd was notorious for using the precise moment of bureaucratic paralysis to launch their final assault. He felt a chilling certainty. They hadn't just stumbled upon the concentration point. They had deliberately timed it, knowing the Allied bureaucracy would freeze the response. This tactical timing revealed a deeper, more unnerving truth about the intelligence they possessed. It wasn't just the enemy's tactics that Thorn understood. He suspected that someone high up had leaked or sold the specific operational procedures, including the mandatory routing delays. Why else would the German advance schedule align so perfectly with the 75-minute bureaucratic lag? Hayes received the final devastating report. Communications with the primary relay center were now intermittent, a combination of enemy jamming and, ironically, the mandatory shift change at the central switchboard. The line was effectively dead. Protocol 4A was crystal clear. Loss of communications meant an immediate halt to all fire mission approvals to prevent friendly fire incidents. The guns must fall silent. The clock hit 3 o'clock. The concentration point was fully formed 300 meters from the vulnerable trench line. The silence that followed the failure of the radio wasn't peaceful. It was a mandate of death, enshrined in the rigid, unyielding logic of military law. Hayes turned to Thorn, his face pale beneath the grime. "Captain, stand down. We have no authorization. We cannot risk misfire without confirmed grid updates." Thorn held his colonel's gaze, not in defiance, but in grim recognition. The forward observer was transmitting one final, fragmented message, a broken cry for help confirming the massive scale of the approaching force. This wasn't a skirmish. It was an avalanche. What Hayes didn't know was that 6 weeks earlier, Thorn had secretly written his own contingency order, unauthorized and unsigned, detailing the precise steps necessary if communications failed. Asterisk and asterisk, a massive attack was confirmed. He had hidden it in the bottom of his ammunition box, preparing for this exact violation. The weight of the system was suffocating. Every regulation Hayes was sworn to uphold screamed halt, yet every fiber of tactical sense screamed fire. The bureaucracy, designed to prevent costly tactical errors, had maneuvered the entire front into a situation where only one error remained possible: mass surrender or annihilation. The rules were created after a disastrous friendly fire incident years prior, meant to save lives by preventing hasty action. Now, those same life-saving protocols guaranteed the loss of thousands because they prioritized accountability over survival in the face of imminent threat. Thorn glanced at his men. They were trained automata, waiting for the formal command sequence. Grid check, elevation confirmed, charge set, fire. But the sequence was broken. The missing link was a piece of paper miles away, stuck on a desk that might as well be on the moon. The captain reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn map section marked in thick blue pencil. It wasn't the official target grid. It was his own calculation, based on historical enemy movement patterns and real-time observer reports. Thorn's map didn't just show the enemy assembly. It showed the predicted target saturation zone Tani Valit the General Staff had previously designated strategically irrelevant, which Thorn knew was the vital nexus of the German advance. Firing on that zone was technically prohibited by standing orders against wasting shells on low-value terrain. The choice was no longer tactical, it was moral. Obey the rules and watch the front shatter. Condemning his comrades to certain death and potentially losing the war, or break every oath, committing an act of absolute insubordination, and save them. The latter choice carried a guaranteed penalty, the firing squad. Thorn understood the paradox. The rules themselves had established a threshold for treason. Thorn realized that adherence to the protocol at this very moment was the truest form of treason against the soldiers fighting in the trenches. His decision was less about heroism and more about accepting the inevitable consequence of necessary disobedience. Hayes was staring at the defunct radio, muttering regulations under his breath, a broken litany of can'ts and must-nots. He was paralyzed by the system he served. Thorn took one last look at his colonel, then turned to his battery sergeant. This guy was just starting to bruise with the false promise of dawn. The enemy would attack with delight. There was no more time for Forms 3 to be or triplicate approvals. The chain of command was a relic of the past 4 hours. Thorn didn't shout fire. He used a single, unauthorized code phrase, known only to his most trusted sergeants, phrase tied to the forgotten secret contingency plan. That phrase was Red Dawn Protocol, and 300 meters away, in the deep dug pit where the 38th Field Artillery Battery waited, the first unsanctioned order was finally given. The weight of the world hung on a few unauthorized words. Captain Elias Thorn was not built for disobedience. He was the product of 3 generations of brass buttons and meticulously filed paperwork, a man whose internal clock ran on Greenwich Mean Time and regulation 30-minute intervals, yet the past 4 hours had warped time into a vicious elastic band, stretching the moments between enemy advances and friendly counterstrikes until they snapped. He stood now, the unauthorized code ringing in the air, a ghost of the man who started the shift. The system demanded patience. The enemy offered none. The primary constraint wasn't ammunition or manpower. It was bureaucracy rendered lethal by distance. The enemy, designated Hammer by intelligence, had shifted their main thrust 40 kilometers south, bypassing the pre-approved grid coordinates. Thorn was still authorized to hit. To request new coordinates required a Form 3-2E, transmission up 3 command levels, approval, signature, and return. Estimated time, 3 hours minimum. Thorn knew the 7th Brigade, already pinned down near the objective, would be overrun in 45 minutes. Colonel Hayes, still slumped over the dead radio console, represented the perfect soldier. Loyal, procedural, and now functionally useless. Hayes wasn't malicious. He was simply incapable of imagining a reality outside the operational guidelines. Thorn, watching the sweat bead on his superior's lip, understood that Hayes's loyalty to the rule book was absolute loyalty that now guaranteed the deaths of 2,000 infantrymen. The tragedy wasn't that the rules were bad, but that they had no emergency stop. The choice was simple, brutal, and mathematically clear. Option A. Wait for the 3-2B approval. Maintain his commission. And watch the 7th Brigade vaporize under enemy fire, guaranteed defeat by procedure. Option B. Violate Article 14, Section 6, unauthorized modification of engagement coordinates, risk court-martial and disgrace, but potentially shift the firing solution now and break the hammer advance. He was staring at a 99% chance of success via treason versus a 100% chance of failure via adherence. The Red Dawn Protocol was never supposed to be activated. It was a theoretical fail drafted by Thorne during a particularly tedious rotation in training exercises 6 years prior. A detailed plan for immediate, massed, preemptive fire in case of total communication blackout and confirmed hostile advance outside the standard engagement zone. It existed purely in the memory banks of Thorne and 3 trusted sergeants. Implementing it bypassed all safety checks, all manual verification, and all civilian oversight. It was professional suicide masquerading as operational necessity. Down in the earthen pits of the 38th, the sergeants, led by the grizzled veteran Sergeant Major Rook, hesitated for only a fraction of a second. They knew the code. They knew the penalty. Roosh had served 30 years without a single disciplinary mark. Now, his hand moved to the unsanctioned map overlay stored beneath his bunk mattress, a violation in itself. The air defense sirens 30 kilometers away began to wail a high, mournful sound, confirmation that the hammer was already closer than command recognized. Fear had ceased to be a factor for Thorne. It had been replaced by a sharp, cold focus, the kind that grips a surgeon staring at a failing heart. He felt the weight of the gold bars on his shoulders, symbols of the authority he was currently demolishing. His only link to the official world was the faint, static-ridden murmur coming from Hayes, reciting the regulations that forbade the action already in motion. Hayes was pleading, not with Thorne, but with the concept of order itself. The Red Dawn Protocol didn't just authorize firing. It demanded a rate of fire 5 times the standard sustained maximum. It was designed to overwhelm, not suppress. It was a desperate flood, not a managed flow. The guns of the 38th, the aging heavy howitzers, named the Iron Dukes, groaned under the strain even before the first shell left the barrel. They were being pushed past their operational limits, risking catastrophic structural failure with every shot. This was not war. It was an artillery suicide pact. Outside the bunker's thick, reinforced walls, the sky was achieving that sickening, pale gray transition, the moment when shadows lose their depths and visibility becomes absolute. This was the moment Hammer always chose to move. Thorne watched the clock. 4:37. If the initial salvo wasn't on target by 4:45, the enemy mechanized units would have cleared the natural choke points. The miracle required 8 minutes of perfect, unauthorized violence. Every second felt like compressed concrete, impossible to move. Hayes finally stirred, his face sheet. He reached for the emergency communication cutoff switch. A red button marked System Halt, Command Override. This action would physically sever all power to the 38th battery. Thorne's reaction was instantaneous and cold. He didn't physically stop Hayes. He simply stepped between Hayes and the switch, blocking the access panel with his body. Hayes didn't fight. He just stared at the rank insignia on Thorne's chest, recognizing the man who had just chosen life over mandate. Then, the world outside the bunker ceased to be quiet. A deep, seismic boom rolled up from the ground, followed by the high, tearing shriek of the first heavy shells ripping through the atmosphere. The floor vibrated violently, sending dust raining down from the ceiling. Hayes flinched, covering his ears. The sound was not the controlled, measured response of official warfare. It was a sustained roar, the sound of rules being broken by sheer kinetic force. The moment the first shell left the tube, Elias Thorne became a criminal. He was no longer Captain Thorne, the prodigy of protocol. He was the architect of a necessary catastrophe. He had chosen the trenches over the tribunal, the survival of his men over his own career longevity. The impossible decision was made, but the consequence, the true price of the Red Dawn Protocol, was yet to be paid. He just had to wait 8 minutes to find out if he was a hero or a traitor. Sergeant Cale, isolated deep within the Citadel's core firing booth, tasted metallic fear. His knuckles were white against the primary firing yoke, the very mechanism designed to prevent accidental deployment now throbbing under his sweaty palms. The Red Dawn Overrider sequence, so restricted it required 3 unique biometric signatures, 2 of which were faked using Thorne's stolen credentials, was screaming live. The system monitor flashed a torrent of red warnings. Critical deviation. Fire solution unapproved by Central Command. Cale ignored the digital panic, focusing on Captain Thorne's strained rasp echoing faintly in his comms unit. He knew this move wasn't tactical brilliance. It was an act of political desperation and shared criminal intent. He hadn't just faked the required command signatures. He had manually bypassed the main hydraulic safeties moments before Thorne gave the final order. This meant Cale was complicit in a criminal act even before Thorne sealed his own fate, tethering their careers to a single kinetic rod ripping through the upper atmosphere. The authorized firing solution. Plan Omega. Targeted inert supply deposer. Useless retaliatory slap across the wrist of the enemy. Thorne, and now Cale, knew the invading force had concentrated their heavy armor not in the depots, but hidden beneath the massive hydroelectric damage geological choke point. Central Command refused to acknowledge existed, blinded by outdated surveillance data. Cale had spent 6 months analyzing that topographical blind spot, running private simulations in his off hours, knowing standard procedure would guarantee mass casualty among their forward scouts. His conviction wasn't based on Thorne's sudden, desperate authority, but on his own unauthorized data modeling. The true risk he ran wasn't just following a rogue captain, but validating months of secret, unsanctioned analysis. The terror gripping him wasn't fear of disciplinary action, but the terrifying possibility that his private math was profoundly wrong. If the dam held, the kinetic bombardment would scatter uselessly, exposing their position utterly, transforming their bunker into a tomb. 3 seconds remained before the system would autolock Cale out, reverting to the useless Omega plan. He felt the cold pressure of time crushing down. Protocol demanded he report the discrepancy up the chain, wait for review, and likely face immediate dismissal for insubordination. But reporting meant critical minutes wasted. Minutes that translated directly into bloody casualties in the field. He saw the grainy infrared feed, the faint heat signatures of their forward reconnaissance patrols, unknowingly moving toward the target's kill zone. Their lives were a stack of chips placed entirely on Cale's gut feeling about geology. He wasn't just gambling his career. The Red Dawn Protocol involved firing experimental, density-enhanced tungsten rods designed for orbital strikes. If they failed to hit the specific, minuscule geological fault line near the dam's base, the sheer force of the impact could trigger a localized seismic event, potentially compromising the structural integrity of their own underground base infrastructure. Thorne hadn't known the full extent of this devastating collateral risk. When he gave the command, Cale, the man who built the targeting matrix, did. The comms crackled once more. "Do it, Sergeant!" Now, Thorne's voice, devoid of rank or polish, just raw pleading stripped down to bone. Cale's breath caught a sharp, ragged inhalation that did nothing to calm his nerves. He slammed his fist down onto the firing stud, bypassing the delicate finesse usually required, activating the primary charge sequence with brute force. A sickening hydraulic groan filled the booth, followed instantly by the deafening, bone-jarring roar described by Hayes and Thorne above. The Citadel shuddered violently, a wounded beast venting its catastrophic fury. The unauthorized trajectory required the main weapon system to exceed its safe rotational limits, a forced high-angle launch. Cale knew the strain was sufficient to compromise the integrity of the main cannon's hydraulic recoil dampeners, meaning even if this shot worked, the entire cannon assembly was likely permanently disabled and potentially explosive if they tried to fire again. He had traded their entire long-range defense capability for one perfect, devastating, and entirely illegal strike. Now came the agonizing wait. 8 minutes until final impact confirmation. The initial roar subsided into a high, sustained whine of internal machinery cooling down and crying out under strain. Cale slumped forward, his forehead resting against the cold steel housing of the display. He was alone, engulfed by the silence of his criminal act. The automated system diagnostics were churning out millions of lines of air, coda perfect, damning digital record of every single protocol violation. He imagined the tribunal, the cold silence of the court-martial room, the judge's stern, unforgiving face. He realized, staring blankly at the rapidly scrolling air log, that the system hadn't just recorded the violations. It had immediately begun uploading the full data package, including the fake biometric inputs, the precise unauthorized trajectory, and the targeting matrix directly to Sector Command's Central Judicial AI designated jury. He couldn't wipe the slate clean. His confession was already in the digital ether, waiting for human eyes to process the true scale of the treason. The infrared feeds showed the target zone. The dam structure itself, solid concrete and reinforced steel, looked absolutely impervious. But Cale wasn't aiming for the structure. He was aiming for the geological seam running exactly 400 meters beneath it, relying on hydrostatic pressure and kinetic energy convergence to shatter the bedrock and bury the hidden armor encampment in a massive, man-made landslide. It was a theoretical strike, a geometry problem solved using forbidden variables. He closed his eyes, remembering the late nights in the simulation lab, fueled by cheap caffeine and the nagging, obsessive certainty that the official plan was absolute suicide. Cale had designed the strike to maximize geological instability. If the target was successfully buried, the ensuing earth tremor was precisely calibrated to mimic a natural disaster, designed specifically to mask the true kinetic origin of the attack from rival satellite surveillance networks. This wasn't just simple treason. It was a complex, perfectly constructed lie meant to deceive not only their superiors but the enemy as well. Every second ticking by was an eternity carved out of the standard 7.5-minute trajectory calculation. He focused intensely on his breathing, trying desperately to drown out the internal voices screaming doubt. What if the seismic profile readings he used were outdated? What if the tungsten rod broke up on re-entry due to the extreme, unauthorized angle of attack? This wasn't just about the mission. It was about the fundamental arrogance required to believe his own private calculus superseded decades of established military doctrine and procedure. Then, a faint, entirely unexpected transmission blinked rapidly on the periphery of his command screen. A highly encrypted, low-power pulse originating from deep within the target area. It wasn't standard enemy communication. It was a distress signal utilizing a long-dormant friendly frequencia only used by deep cover operatives who were supposed to have evacuated. Weeks ago, someone Cale thought was safe was still down there, directly beneath the trajectory of the falling kinetic payload. The discovery gutted him instantly. The calculated necessity of the strike suddenly had a specific, terrible, human face attached to it. He couldn't possibly abort. Not now the shell was already halfway through the stratosphere, irrevocably committed. He could only watch the clock tick down, 4 minutes remaining. He had chosen the lives of hundreds of forward troops over this single, unexpected friendly contact. The tactical move was ruthlessly justified, coldly logical, and now deeply, irrevocably stained by potential friendly fire. The distressed signal wasn't random noise. It contained 3 quick, repeating characters. 7-4 Bravo. That was the call sign of his former squad commander, a man Cale had explicitly told to abandon the sector 2 weeks prior, believing the threat was too high. Cale realized the crushing depth of his isolation. He had not just defied command, he had potentially murdered the man who taught him everything he knew, simply because his superior officer refused to obey Cale's private assessment of danger. The metallic taste returned, sharper than ever before. Hero or traitor? The question felt too simple, too cheap. Cale knew the truth was far dirtier. He was a necessary villain, a pragmatist who had traded military honor for brutal tactical reality. He stared at the impact time display, waiting for the seismic spike, waiting for the sound that would either validate his treason or reduce the entire Citadel complex to rubble, burying him and Thorn under the weight of their impossible, necessary decision. The clock hit 0. The sound wasn't the clean, directional boom Cale had calculated. It was a geological ruptura, deep, tearing sound that swallowed the air pressure in the control room, followed by a double impact, the primary payload hitting the divisional headquarters, and the secondary, an unplanned shockwave, reflecting off the Citadel's deep foundation. The lights flickered violently, plunging Thorn and Cale into momentary darkness, lit only by the angry red glow of emergency indicators. Cale instinctively gripped the edge of the console, his teeth grinding against the phantom metallic taste, knowing that this single moment was the fulcrum upon which the fate of the entire Western Frontant, his own life, now rested. Thorn slammed a hand onto the auxiliary power feed, dragging the sensor suite back to life. The 3D topographical map, seconds ago riddled with thousands of enemy identifiers, was now a dead gray zone, centered precisely on the coordinate Cale had punched in. The erasure was total. The entire enemy division, the spearhead intended to break the Citadel's defenses before dawn, simply ceased to exist. Yet, the comms panel, despite the seismic shock, began flashing a persistent, faint blue light. It wasn't the main command channel. It was a secured frequency they thought was long dormant. Cale ignored the blue flicker, focusing on the immediate damage assessment. Casualties were estimated, but the hard data was needed. He punched in the code for the secondary sweep filter. Friendly identifier 7-4 Bravo. The screen buffed agonizingly slow. The sensor returned a negative reading for active biosigns within the blast radius standard, but then an anomaly. Residual energy signature consistent with a destroyed but recently functional, high-output tactical radio transmitter, exactly matching the specs of Bravo's kit, positioned 80 meters from ground zero. He hadn't killed 7-4 Bravo instantly. He had caught him mid-transmission. Thorn looked away from Cale's face, focusing on the wider strategic overlay. The enemy division was gone, yes, but the ripple effect was immense. Forward operational intelligence reported immediate confusion across all hostile flanks. Their planned simultaneous assault had failed before it even started. The front line, which was projected to collapse within 2 hours, stabilized immediately. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of lives were demonstrably saved by the eradication of that single point of danger. The cost, however, was still staring Cale down in the form of the destroyed radio signature. The main comms burst to life, overriding the emergency alarms. It wasn't a formal channel. It was the direct line from General Valeri's, usually reserved for Armageddon scenarios. Valeri's voice, usually a gravelly roar, was a low, dangerous hiss, crackling through the speakers. Cale. Report. I see a 900-meter crater where my enemy assets were supposed to be advancing, and I see 3 full brigades of my own forces alive. I also see an unauthorized firing solution using the Citadel's strategic platform, specifically prohibited under Article 4. Did you fire the orbital battery, Major? Cale took a slow, agonizing breath, the air thick with ozone and dust. Thorn remained silent, the loyal second finally understanding the depth of Cale's isolation. Cale didn't apologize or offer excuses. General, Cale's voice was steady, almost monotone. The enemy spearhead was targeting the command post bypass network. They had confirmation of the gap. I eliminated the threat. We bought the Citadel 48 hours of reinforcement time. Tactical reality dictated the maneuver. He omitted the 7-4 Bravo detail, but Valeris, apparently, didn't need reminding of minor details when facing a potential treason charge. Tactical reality is dictated by the General Staff, Major, not by rogue battery commanders. Valeria spat out. However, the forward troops are reporting impossible survival rates. You saved Regiment 12. Entirely. That means nothing regarding your breach of protocol. The system logs are already tagged for immediate military tribunal review. Your career is over, Cale. But there's a file attached to the incoming sensor feed, a reconnaissance drone package sent 30 seconds before your unauthorized launch. It wasn't enemy data. It was friendly, highly sensitive intel. Thorn finally spoke, his voice dry. The blue light, sir. The secured frequency. That's the drone feed. He toggled the blue flicker onto the main screen. The feed showed the enemy division exactly where Cale targeted them, but the drone camera lingered for a crucial 2 seconds on the ground, revealing not just enemy troops, but a dozen civilian transport vehicles, disguised but clearly marked with medical insignia, hidden among the lead armor column. The enemy was using human shields, deployed precisely where 7-4 Bravo had been transmitting from. Valerius's hiss turned into genuine silence, heavy and agonizing. Do you see that, Major? You didn't just save Regiment 12. You erased the tactical advantage the enemy thought was untouchable. Your insubordination is unforgivable. Your success is undeniable. I have reports stating you should be executed by sundown, and counter-reports demanding the Congressional Medal of Valor be struck in your name by sunrise. We are caught, Major, between discipline and desperation. Cale looked at the screen at the gray coordinates where his former mentor and innocent civilians likely perished and felt nothing but cold validation. He had known the cost was total. General, Cale said, the metallic taste finally receding. Replaced by the sterile numbness of absolute command, the choice is simple. If you execute me, you set the precedent that saving lives is secondary to obeying failed orders. If you decorate me, you destroy the chain of command structure that holds the Citadel together. The enemy knows this now. They will exploit your hesitation. A long pause stretched between them, thick with the scent of burning electronics. I don't have time for philosophy. Kale Valerius finally ground out. The enemy is regrouping. You bought us 48 hours, and I need every second. Stand by for formal debrief. You are relieved of command of the Citadel battery, effective immediately. Do not leave the control room. A detachment of the Internal Security Corps is en route, and Major concerning 724 Bravo Diddy transmit a warning about the medical convoy before impact. Kale closed his eyes, remembering the 3 repeating characters. He opened them and lied. Negativi, General. He just signaled distress. The air in the control room was stale, thick with ozone and unresolved tension. The security detachment arrived not to arrest Kale, but to escort him. A temporary reprieve, perhaps, or perhaps the general's shrewd way of keeping him close while the politicians debated whether to hang him or grant him the Order of the Shining Star. For the next 3 weeks, Operation Zenith, unauthorized strike that saved the Citadel, was dissected, debated, and ultimately sanitized. History, Valerius learned, cared little for the meticulous balance of military law. It worshipped results. Kale's victory had been too profound, the strategic window too vital. The cost, the betrayal of Major 724 Bravo, and the loss of the medical convoy faded into necessary footnotes, overshadowed by the immediate salvation of millions. Kale was eventually transferred. His record officially marked commendation for critical strategic innovation, quietly shelved beneath the ambiguous note, relieved due to unsuitability for conventional command. The true lesson of Zenith was not about conventional heroism. It was about the fatal flaw in rigid leadership, the inability of inflexible structures to handle absolute extremity. Kale's unauthorized brilliance exposed that true wartime leadership sometimes requires the total abandonment of discipline, creating a paradoxal leader who is simultaneously the state's greatest asset and its most terrifying vulnerability. He did not defeat the enemy so much as he redefined the rules of victory by choosing to lie about 724 Bravo's final communication. Kale had fully embraced the role of the cold pragmatist, ensuring that the necessary truth of the sacrifice remained buried with the debris. And yet, in the hallowed halls of the Citadel, they knew the truth. The law was broken. The old discipline was irrevocably shattered. As General Valerius looked at the new generation of officers, their eyes shining with a dangerous, unauthorized ambition, he knew Kale hadn't just won a battle. He had started a quiet internal war. The deepest silence is always found where the greatest lie resides. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of morality and military might. If you found this reflection on Kale's choice compelling, please like this video, subscribe for more deep dives into complex narratives, and let us know in the comments, was Kale a hero or a rogue?